Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time right now. I truly love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. If you have not subscribed yet, please take a moment to subscribe and like this channel. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. Stay with me until the very end, because this is a story you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Relax, remove every distraction around you, and pay very close attention as we begin. They called it a silly trick. That is what the men said at first. They laughed when they heard how the first rider died. They said it was carelessness. They said it was bad luck. They said Texas soil had always been rough and unforgiving. But laughter faded quickly in the autumn of 1859, because by the 11th night, 38 professional slave catchers were dead, and no one could explain how. Her name was Dorcas Miller. Most people barely noticed her. She washed clothes. She carried water. She kept her eyes low and her voice softer than the wind. If you passed her in the yard, you might forget her face within seconds. That was her greatest strength. In a world where enslaved women were forced to shrink themselves to survive, invisibility could become a shield or a weapon. 3 miles from the Rio Grande River, where freedom waited just beyond the border in Mexico, Dorcas lost everything. Her daughter, Mercy, was only 12 years old. The girl had memorized the path south. She believed in freedom the way children believe in sunrise. Certain, bright, unstoppable. That night, the moon was high. The air felt heavy with hope. They were so close they could almost taste safety. Then the dogs began barking. Then horses thundered through brush. Then a single gunshot tore the silence apart. Dorcas did not scream. She did not beg. She watched as Mercy fell into the dust. She watched as the men rode closer, rifles still smoking. She heard them laugh as they tore up her freedom papers, documents she had protected for years, proof that she had once been promised liberty. The paper drifted into the dirt like dry leaves. One of the men kicked Mercy's body aside, as if she were nothing more than fallen timber. Something inside Dorcas did not shatter. It hardened, cold, focused, patient. The men who killed her daughter were not random criminals. They were professionals, slave catchers who earned fortunes hunting human beings trying to escape to Mexico. Southeast Texas in 1859 had become a hunting ground. Every captured runaway meant reward money. Every broken family meant profit. These men rode proudly, armed with rifles, ropes, and dogs trained to track fear. They believed they were untouchable. But Dorcas had grown up around honey locust trees. As a child, she had once stepped on one of their long thorns. The pain had burned for days. She had seen a mule collapse after a spike pierced deep into its hoof. Honey locust thorns were simple, hard, nearly invisible in darkness, and when they broke the skin, infection followed quickly in the humid Texas heat. That memory returned to her as she knelt beside her daughter's lifeless body. The first night was quiet. A rider, named Eli Turner, took a narrow trail he often used when tracking runaways. He rode confidently beneath the stars. He did not notice the slight change in the soil. He did not see the small spikes carefully pressed upright into soft mud along a bend in the path. His horse stepped first. The animal screamed and collapsed violently. Eli fell forward, cursing the darkness. When he tried to stand, a sharp pain exploded through his boot. A thorn had pierced straight through leather into flesh. Another drove into his palm as he caught himself on the ground. He limped home, angry but dismissive. By morning, his foot had swollen badly. Within 2 days, fever consumed him. By the 3rd day, he was dead. People called it an accident. Trails were dangerous. Animals stumbled all the time. No one suspected intention. No one imagined design. On the 2nd night, another rider fell. On the 3rd, 2 more. The pattern was subtle. The traps appeared only on routes slave catchers favored, not near farms, not near town markets. Only along the shadowed paths leading south, the same paths Mercy had tried to follow. Someone knew their movements. Someone was watching carefully. During the day, Dorcas remained exactly who they believed she was. She washed blood from shirts. She scrubbed dirt from trousers. She carried buckets of water and listened. Men spoke freely around her. They bragged about which trails they would patrol next. They complained about losing easy money. They joked about curses in the woods. Dorcas memorized every word. That night, long after lanterns dimmed, she walked into the forest alone, carrying a small cloth sack filled with honey locust thorns. She moved without fear. The woods felt different now, not threatening, protective. She pressed each thorn carefully into the soil, at angles that would pierce hooves and boots alike. She covered them lightly with leaves. She studied the ground the way hunters studied prey. When she finished, she erased her own footprints with a branch. Then she returned before dawn, hands steady, face calm. By the 5th night, fear had begun to spread. Carter Wilkes, a seasoned slave catcher, was found near his fallen horse, his leg blackened from infection. He had tried to cut open the wound himself with a knife. Blood soaked the earth around him. He died, raving about spears rising from the dirt. Newspapers in nearby towns whispered about strange deaths, but avoided details. Everyone knew who was dying. No one knew why. Dorcas did not rush. She did not grow careless. Patience became her discipline. On the 7th night, 3 riders traveled together for safety. They carried lanterns and scanned the ground, mocking rumors. Dorcas had anticipated this. She had planted thorns not only along straight paths, but near sharp bends, where riders would turn quickly without looking down. One horse stumbled first. The others panicked in the darkness. In confusion, one rider fell into a shallow dip she had lined days before, with dozens of spikes hidden beneath loose soil. His scream echoed through the trees before fading into silence. The remaining men fled in terror. Whispers turned into dread. Ministers spoke of divine punishment. Plantation owners held private meetings. Slave catching was profitable work. Now it seemed cursed. Some riders refused night patrols. Others demanded double pay. A few quietly left the region entirely. Dorcas counted silently. 8 nights, 9 nights, and 10. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. Each thorn pressed into the earth felt like a message carved into fate. You destroyed my child. You tore my freedom into pieces. You thought I was powerless. On the 10th night, a respected slave catcher named Benjamin Crow rode out determined to end what he called foolish superstition. He had hunted runaways for 20 years. He dismissed fear as weakness. Near a swampy stretch of trail, his horse stepped onto a patch Dorcas had prepared carefully over several evenings. The ground looked ordinary. Beneath the thin layer of mud stood dozens of upright thorns. The animal collapsed instantly. Benjamin fell forward, his hands striking directly onto hidden spikes. They pierced deep into his palms and wrists. Within 2 days, infection spread rapidly through his body. He died furious and confused, unable to accept that something so small had defeated him. By the 11th night, Southeast Texas had changed. 38 slave catchers were dead, all from accidents, all from wounds no one could fully explain. Trails once busy with armed riders grew quiet. Escape routes toward Mexico opened like narrow doors in the dark. For the first time in years, runaways moved south with less fear of pursuit. And still, no one suspected Dorcas Miller, the washerwoman, the quiet one, the grieving mother who lowered her eyes and spoke softly. She remained invisible, just as they preferred her to be. But invisibility had become her shield and her sword. The question remains, was it justice or revenge? What would you have done if your child lay only 3 miles from freedom, silenced by men who laughed as they destroyed your last proof of liberty? Why do textbooks rarely speak of resistance that does not come with speeches and flags, but with silence and thorns? Stay with shadows of black history, because this is only the beginning. Dorcas did not stop on the 11th night. She paused. There is a difference. The woods had grown tense, almost alert, as if the trees themselves were listening. Riders no longer thundered boldly through the dark. Lanterns flickered cautiously along the main roads, but the narrow escape paths toward the Rio Grande were suddenly avoided. Fear had shifted. It no longer lived in the hearts of the hunted. It had crept quietly into the boots of the hunters. During the day, nothing about her changed. That was the most frightening part. She still bent over wash tubs with steady hands. She still wrung out shirts that smelled of sweat and tobacco. She still moved through rooms as if she were invisible. Men argued loudly around her about the losses. 38 men gone in less than 2 weeks. Profits shrinking. Reputation damaged. Some blamed sickness. Some blamed sabotage from across the Mexican border. Others whispered about spirits in the woods. Not one of them looked twice at Dorcas. But Dorcas was listening more carefully than ever. Grief had sharpened her memory. She knew which plantations were tightening patrols and which ones were quietly pulling back. She knew which slave catchers had brothers eager to avenge them. She understood that revenge without caution would lead to suspicion. So, she shifted her strategy. The thorns became fewer, more precise. She no longer planted them every night. She waited. She studied. She allowed fear to grow on its own. Because fear, once planted, spreads faster than any thorn. By late autumn of 1859, the slave-catching business in southeast Texas had slowed dramatically. Men refused to travel alone at night. Some demanded written guarantees of payment in case of injury. Plantation owners began discussing alternatives. Dogs were used more often. Patrols were shortened. Routes were changed. But Dorcas had memorized every bend and hollow long before they realized they were being studied. One evening, she overheard something that made her heart pound. A group of slave catchers planned a large, coordinated sweep near the river. They believed runaways were using a particular stretch of woodland that had grown suspiciously quiet since the deaths. They intended to surround it with 10 riders and drive inward like hunters, closing in on trapped deer. Dorcas understood immediately. If that sweep succeeded, dozens of freedom seekers could be captured or killed. That night, she moved earlier than usual. The air felt colder. The moon hid behind thin clouds. She carried not only thorns, but also small, sharpened sticks she had carved patiently over weeks. She worked with urgency, but not panic. Along the narrowest entry points into the woodland, she planted her invisible defenses. She targeted places where horses would naturally accelerate, where men would focus forward instead of downward. She layered the earth carefully, covering every spike with fallen leaves that matched the forest floor perfectly. When the sweep began 2 nights later, the riders moved confidently. 10 men, spreading outward, pushing into the trees. They expected to flush out frightened runaways. Instead, confusion erupted almost immediately. One horse stumbled, then another. A rider cursed as his boots sank into something sharp. Dogs began barking wildly as their handlers struggled to control them. In the chaos, 2 riders collided. One was thrown hard against a tree. Another tumbled into a shallow ditch Dorcas had prepared days before. The sweep collapsed into panic. Lanterns fell and shattered. Horses bolted in different directions. By dawn, 3 more slave catchers were severely wounded. None died that morning, but word spread quickly that the woods were no longer safe for organized hunts. Something unseen was fighting back with intelligence and patience. Dorcas stood far from the commotion, hidden behind dense brush. She did not smile. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was something quieter. Balance. For every scream she had swallowed beside her daughter's body, the forest now answered with its own echo. As weeks passed, more enslaved families began whispering about safer passage south. News traveled through coded songs and quiet conversations near wells. The path toward Mexico was not free of danger, but it was no longer heavily patrolled. Some said 30, others said 50. Some claimed over 300, eventually crossed with fewer encounters than before. No records would ever fully confirm the number, but the shift was undeniable. Dorcas never guided them openly. That would have exposed her. Instead, she adjusted the landscape. When she heard of increased patrols on one trail, she made that trail hostile to riders. When she learned a different path had been ignored, she left it untouched. She shaped movement without being seen. She was not just reacting anymore. She was directing the flow of resistance. Yet danger still surrounded her. Suspicion, once planted, can grow in unexpected places. One afternoon, a plantation overseer noticed her hands were scratched. The marks were small but numerous. He grabbed her wrist and demanded an explanation. Dorcas lowered her eyes and said she had gathered firewood. He studied her face for a long moment. Then he shoved her away, dismissing her as harmless. Harmless. The word almost made her laugh. Winter approached slowly. The humid heat eased, but infections remained deadly. The earlier wounds inflicted by the thorns continued claiming lives days after initial injuries. What seemed minor at first often turned fatal. The region counted more losses quietly. The official number remained 38 for that intense stretch of 11 nights, but additional deaths followed from complications. The legend grew larger than the facts. Men began carrying thick planks to lay across suspicious patches of ground. Some dismounted and walked cautiously before riding through certain bends. Every extra precaution slowed them down. Every delay gave more runaways a head start. Fear had become a tax on oppression. Dorcas often visited the place where mercy had fallen. She never stayed long. She would kneel, press her palm to the earth, and breathe slowly. Grief still lived inside her, but it no longer paralyzed her. It guided her. She understood something powerful. Systems built on cruelty rely on certainty. Certainty that the oppressed will remain afraid. Certainty that resistance will be loud and easily crushed. She had shattered that certainty with something dismissed as small. One evening, months after the first thorn-pierced leather, a new rumor reached her ears. A wealthy plantation owner from deeper in Texas was offering a reward for information about whoever was sabotaging slave catchers. He believed it was an organized group. He promised money and protection to anyone who could identify the culprit. Dorcas felt the weight of risk settle on her shoulders again. Rewards make desperate men observant, so she adapted once more. The forest work stopped completely for several weeks. No new traps, no fresh disturbances. She allowed calm to return. She washed clothes. She hummed softly while working. She avoided wooded paths even during daylight. Let them grow comfortable again, she told herself. Let them believe the threat has passed. And slowly, riders began venturing deeper into the woods once more. Not boldly as before, but cautiously enough to suggest confidence was returning. Dorcas watched and waited. Revenge alone was never her true goal. Disruption was. Protection was. If patrols stayed light, she did not need to act. Years later, some would claim the deaths were exaggerated. Others would insist they were divine punishment. A few would whisper about an unnamed avenger who used the land itself as a weapon. But Dorcas Miller's name rarely appeared in written records. History often prefers loud heroes and clear battles. It struggles with quiet strategy. It overlooks women who fight without banners. Yet the impact remained. Southeast Texas never fully regained its aggressive slave-catching network near the Mexican border after 1859. Too many families had lost sons. Too many riders feared the unseen. The cost had risen beyond profit. Dorcas grew older. Lines formed around her eyes. Her hair hrishtwastasaptadat. She never spoke openly about those 11 nights, not even to those she trusted most. Silence had protected her then, and it continued to protect her long after, but sometimes, when she passed a honey locust tree heavy with thorns, she would pause. She would touch one gently, almost respectfully. Small things, she understood, can change the direction of history. And now I ask you again, what is justice when the law protects cruelty? What is revenge when it opens doors for hundreds seeking freedom? If you stood where she stood, 3 miles from liberty with your child lying still in the dust, what choice would you make? Stay with shadows of black history. These are the stories that refuse to disappear. Time moved forward, but the echo of those nights never truly faded. Even when the thorns stopped piercing boots, even when the fever stopped spreading from wound to wound, something deeper had already taken root in Southeast Texas. It was not just fear, it was doubt. And doubt is dangerous to any system built on control. Plantation owners began arguing among themselves. Some said slave catching had become too risky near the Mexican border. Others accused rival groups of spreading false rumors to damage business. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Voices rose, accusations flew. But no clear enemy could be named. You cannot fight what you cannot see. Dorcas understood that better than anyone. She had learned the power of being unseen long before she ever pressed a thorn into the soil. As an enslaved woman, survival required silence, careful steps, and constant observation. She had turned years of forced invisibility into strategy. Every insult she endured, every order barked at her, every assumption about her weakness had become a shield. They had trained her to be ignored, and in ignoring her, they had handed her the greatest advantage. Winter of 1859 slowly gave way to the early months of 1860. The air felt lighter near the border. More small groups slipped south at night. Some traveled alone. Others moved in quiet pairs. Word spread carefully through coded language and spiritual songs, through whispers exchanged while drawing water, through glances that carried entire messages without a single word spoken. The woods were still dangerous, but not like before. Riders no longer rushed headlong into every rumor of escape. They weighed risk against reward. Many chose to stay home. One evening, Dorcas overheard a conversation that made her pause. Two plantation men were discussing the growing tension between northern and southern states. Talk of secession. Talk of war. The country itself was beginning to fracture. The institution of slavery, once treated as permanent and unshakable, now stood at the center of a storm. Dorcas listened quietly, realizing something powerful. Her personal act of resistance was part of something larger unfolding across the nation. The ground was shifting everywhere, not just beneath the boots of slave catchers, but danger never truly disappeared. A new group of riders arrived from deeper within Texas, men unfamiliar with the earlier deaths. They dismissed the old stories as exaggeration. They believed themselves tougher, smarter, immune to whatever had happened months before. Dorcas noticed their confidence immediately. She saw the way they rode fast and loud. She heard their careless laughter. Confidence can erase caution. She wrestled with herself for several nights. Should she act again? Or would action now draw attention? She understood the balance had to be exact. Too much disruption would lead to investigation. Too little would invite aggression. Finally, after hearing that the new riders planned to intensify patrols near a well-used escape path, she made her decision. The forest greeted her, like an old ally. The honey locust trees still stood tall, their long thorns scattered across the ground like silent soldiers. She gathered them carefully, her fingers moving with practiced ease. But this time she did something different. Instead of planting many across wide stretches, she selected one narrow crossing where horses would be forced to slow near a shallow creek. There, she placed only a handful, positioned with precision. Not enough to create chaos, just enough to remind. 2 nights later, one of the new riders returned home limping badly, his horse injured. He spoke of sharp spikes hidden near the creek. He did not die. The wound was painful but not fatal. Yet the story traveled fast among his companions. The old fear resurfaced, like a memory that had never fully healed. The riders reduced their patrols almost immediately. Dorcas felt no need to count anymore. Numbers had served their purpose. The message had already been delivered months earlier, during those 11 terrible nights. Now, subtle reminders were enough to maintain distance. As 1860 approached and the nation edged closer to civil war, the slave-catching economy near that stretch of border never regained its former strength. Resources shifted toward larger political conflicts. Patrols became irregular. Attention moved elsewhere. For many enslaved families, this distraction created rare windows of opportunity. Some seized them. Some hesitated, fearful of new unknowns. Freedom is never simple, even when the path clears. Dorcas aged quietly through these changing times. The grief for mercy never vanished. It softened in shape, but never in presence. Sometimes at dusk, when the sky turned the same pale color it had the night her daughter fell, Dorcas would close her eyes and remember the sound of that single gunshot. She would remember the feel of torn paper drifting through dust. But she would also remember the sound of horses collapsing in the dark, the confusion of men who believed themselves invincible. She would remember that power can be challenged in ways the powerful never anticipate. No monument was ever built for her. No official record praised her strategy. The official histories would focus on generals and battles once the Civil War erupted in 1861. They would speak of presidents and proclamations. They would rarely mention the quiet resistance that preceded open conflict. Yet resistance has many forms. Some carry rifles. Others carry sacks of thorns. Years later, when slavery finally ended and the nation attempted to rebuild itself, older men in southeast Texas still told stories around fires about the season when the woods turned against slave catchers. They disagreed on details. Some swore it was a group of rebels. Others insisted it was supernatural punishment. None of them imagined that the architect had once washed their shirts and scrubbed their floors. Dorcas never corrected them. Silence remained her companion. She understood that survival sometimes means letting others misunderstand you. Recognition was not her goal. Protection had been. Disruption had been. Opening space for even a few more families to reach freedom had been enough. And so, the story lingers, not because it appears in textbooks, but because it forces us to reconsider what resistance looks like. It challenges the belief that only loud acts shape history. It reminds us that those dismissed as powerless often carry the sharpest tools. Now I want to hear from you. Was Dorcas justified in what she did? Or does taking 38 lives, even in the face of such cruelty, cross a line that should never be crossed? When laws protect injustice, what options remain for those trapped beneath them? Tell me where you are watching from. Share your thoughts. And if this story has held your attention, if it has made you question what you thought you knew about resistance during slavery, subscribe to Shadows of Black History and like this video, because hidden stories like this deserve to be remembered, discussed, and passed on. The years that followed did not erase what happened in those woods. They only layered new events on top of old wounds. When war finally broke out in 1861, Texas joined the Confederacy, and the entire region shifted into another kind of fear. Young men who once hunted runaways now marched off in gray uniforms. Plantations tightened control over the enslaved, worried that chaos would invite rebellion. But chaos also opens cracks, and Dorcas had spent her life learning how to move through cracks. With many able-bodied white men away at war, patrols grew thinner. Supplies grew scarce, attention divided. For the enslaved, this created both danger and opportunity. Some overseers became more violent out of anxiety. Others grew careless. Dorcas watched carefully. She no longer planted thorns, the way she had during those 11 nights of concentrated fury. The message had already been delivered years earlier. Now her role shifted. She became a quiet messenger. Under the cover of ordinary chores, she carried information. She memorized which plantations had fewer guards. She noted which river crossings were lightly watched. She whispered warnings when patrols were scheduled. She never positioned herself as a leader. Leaders attract suspicion. She remained what she had always been, a washerwoman, a laborer, a woman no one bothered to fear. But beneath that surface, she was a map-maker of freedom. Sometimes at night, she would sit outside her small cabin and look toward the south. She would think about mercy, about the 3 miles that had separated her daughter from safety. That distance haunted her. 3 miles is not far. A person can walk it in less than an hour. Yet in 1859, it had been the distance between life and death. Dorcas often wondered how many more would reach that final stretch because of the fear she had planted in those woods. She would never know exact numbers, but she had seen enough quiet departures to believe the answer was not small. As the war dragged on, rumors reached the plantations about President Abraham Lincoln and something called the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The news traveled slowly to Texas. Many enslaved people did not hear about it for months. Even when they did, Freedom on paper did not always mean freedom in practice. Enforcement depended on Union soldiers, and Texas was far from the main battle lines. For Dorcas, paper promises held little comfort. She remembered too clearly how her own freedom papers had been torn apart in the dirt. When Union forces finally reached parts of Texas in 1865, and word spread that slavery was officially ending, the reaction was mixed. Some cried openly. Some stood silent in disbelief. Some feared retaliation. Freedom after generations of bondage can feel unreal, fragile, almost dangerous. Dorcas felt something different. Not surprise, not overwhelming joy. She felt a deep, quiet exhaustion. The system that had stolen her child had finally cracked, but the cost had been beyond measure. She walked once more to the place where Mercy had fallen. The forest had changed over the years. New growth covered old scars. Leaves fell and returned season after season. Dorcas knelt and pressed her palm into the earth again. This time, she whispered aloud. Not revenge, not anger, just her daughter's name. She told Mercy that the chains had fallen. She told her that the men who believed themselves untouchable were gone or powerless now. She told her that the 3 miles to freedom were no longer guarded by riders with ropes. Life after slavery did not become easy. Freedom did not erase poverty or prejudice. The years of Reconstruction brought new struggles, new dangers, new forms of control. But something fundamental had shifted. The law no longer recognized her as property. No one could legally tear up her papers again and claim ownership over her body. That change mattered, even if justice remained incomplete. Older now, Dorcas became known among her community, not for the legend in the woods, but for her steady wisdom. Younger women sought her advice. Men respected her quiet strength. Children listened when she spoke about caution and courage. She never described the thorns in detail. She did not recount numbers, but she would sometimes say this: never underestimate small tools in steady hands. In time, the generation who remembered the slave-catching terror aged and passed away. Stories softened into folklore. Details blurred. The number 38 became a whisper rather than a headline. Some claimed it had been fewer. Others swore it had been more. History often struggles to preserve what powerful people wish to forget. Yet the impact could still be traced in subtle ways. That stretch of woodland near the border remained lightly traveled long after the war. Old habits of fear die slowly. Dorcas lived long enough to see children born into freedom, even if that freedom came with hardship. She watched them run across fields without fear of being sold away. She watched families stay intact through seasons that once would have torn them apart. Every time she saw a young girl laugh beneath open sky, she felt both joy and sorrow. Joy for the life unfolding. Sorrow for the life Mercy never lived. And so we return to the heart of this story. A woman dismissed as simple. A trick mocked as silly. Honey locust thorns pressed quietly into mud. 11 nights that changed the rhythm of oppression in one corner of Texas. Was it justice? Was it revenge? Or was it something more complex? An act born from unbearable loss and sharpened by intelligence. History does not always give us clean answers. It gives us moments. Choices made in darkness. Consequences that ripple outward in ways no one can fully measure. Dorcas Miller did not stand on a battlefield with a flag in her hand. She stood alone in the woods with a sack of thorns. Yet her actions disrupted a system that thrived on certainty and fear. She forced armed men to look down at the ground before every step. She turned the land itself into an ally. If this story has stirred something in you, take a moment now. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me where you are watching from. Do you believe small acts can create large change? And if you have not already, subscribe to Shadows of Black History and like this video. Because stories like this remind us that resistance does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes, in the quiet of night, it reshapes the world without anyone seeing it happen. Even after freedom was declared in 1865, Dorcas understood something many did not say out loud. Chains can fall from wrists, yet fear can remain in the mind. The war had ended slavery in law, but the habits of cruelty did not disappear overnight. Former slave catchers did not suddenly become kind men. Plantation owners did not wake up transformed. The world had changed, but it had not healed. Dorcas watched carefully as new systems began to form. Contracts replaced chains. Wages replaced forced labor, but they were often unfair and confusing. Many newly freed families could not read the documents placed before them. Dorcas remembered how paper had once been used against her. Freedom papers torn apart in the dust. Promises that meant nothing in the face of violence. She encouraged others to be cautious, to ask questions, to learn letters and numbers if they could. Knowledge, she believed, was another kind of thorn. Small, sharp, and powerful when used wisely. The legend of the woods never fully disappeared. In quiet corners of church gatherings, older men sometimes spoke of the season when riders fell like leaves. They lowered their voices when describing it. Some laughed nervously, as if embarrassed by how deeply fear had once gripped them. Others insisted it had been the work of a hidden group of rebels. A few swore they had seen strange shadows moving between trees. Dorcas would sit nearby, listening without expression. The truth rested calmly inside her. She did not need to correct them. One afternoon, many years later, a young boy asked her directly about the stories. He had heard whispers from elders and wanted to know if they were true. Dorcas studied his face for a long moment. The boy's eyes were bright, curious, unburdened by the weight she had carried at his age. She told him this. Sometimes, the land fights back through the hands of those who love it most. The boy frowned, not fully understanding. She smiled softly. Some truth, she knew, must unfold slowly. As Reconstruction faded and new forms of oppression began to rise in the South, Dorcas felt a familiar tension return to the air. Laws changed again. Restrictions tightened in subtle ways. Violence did not disappear. It shifted shape. She saw fear trying to creep back into her community. And once more, she reminded those around her that fear only wins when it goes unchallenged. Her resistance now was not made of thorns, but of stories. She told young people about courage. She told them that even in the darkest times, someone can find a way to push back. She often walked near honey locust trees during her later years. The thorns still hung long and sharp from their branches. Sunlight would catch them and make them shine like small blades. She would touch one carefully and remember the weight of that small sack in her hands during those 11 nights. She would remember the silence of the forest, the distant hooves, the sudden cries, the shift of power that followed. But she also remembered something deeper. She remembered the moment after Mercy fell, when despair could have swallowed her whole. She remembered choosing not to collapse under grief. That choice, more than the thorns themselves, had changed everything. The decision to act rather than surrender. The decision to use what was available instead of waiting for rescue. That was the true weapon. As she aged, her steps slowed. Her hands trembled slightly when she worked, yet her mind remained sharp. She would sometimes sit beneath a wide sky at dusk and reflect on how history often overlooks the quiet. Battles are recorded, speeches are printed, but the small acts that tip the balance often remain hidden. She did not resent that. She understood it. Systems that rely on power rarely celebrate those who outsmart them. When Dorcas finally reached the end of her life, she passed quietly, surrounded by people who knew her as strong, steady, wise. Few knew the full truth of what she had done in 1859. Fewer still understood how carefully she had measured each step, but the impact of her actions had already rippled outward beyond her own lifetime. Families who reached Mexico during that fragile window carried forward generations who would never know chains. Children born free because patrols had weakened. Paths cleared because riders were afraid to ride. And now, here we are, speaking her name. Dorcas Miller. A woman history nearly erased. A mother whose grief turned into strategy. A washerwoman who used honey locust thorns to challenge armed men. A figure who forces us to rethink what power truly looks like. So I ask you one final time, when injustice stands tall and armed, what tools remain for those denied every advantage? Can something dismissed as silly become unstoppable in the right hands? And if you were faced with unbearable loss, would you choose silence, surrender, or resistance shaped by patience and precision? Tell me your city, your country, and the time you are watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this journey through shadows has opened your eyes, subscribe to Shadows of Black History and like this video. Because as long as these stories are told, the quiet heroes of our past will never fully disappear. Long after Dorcas was laid to rest, the land still remembered. Pine needles continued to fall over the same narrow trails. Rain softened the soil where hooves once struck in panic. Honey locust trees kept growing, their thorns forming again and again with each new season. Nature does not forget its own design. And in that design lived the echo of what one woman had done with patience and pain. In the years that followed her passing, children of those who escaped into Mexico began asking about their beginnings. Some families spoke openly. Others kept details guarded, fearful that even freedom could be reversed. But in certain homes near the border, elders would lean forward and whisper about a time when the hunters became the hunted. They spoke about how riders once refused to enter the woods at night. They described boots pierced by invisible spikes. They spoke of fear spreading among men who had once spread fear themselves. Dorcas's name was rarely attached to those stories, but her spirit was present in every telling. She had proven something that could not be undone. Power does not always sit on horseback. Sometimes it kneels in the dirt and studies the ground. Sometimes it listens more than it speaks. Sometimes it waits. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, written records still failed to capture her story. Histories of Texas focused on battles, on politics, on railroads and oil. The slave-catching terror of 1859 was reduced to scattered references, if mentioned at all. The deaths were labeled accidents. The disruption was blamed on disease or misfortune. It is easier for history to accept chaos than to admit calculated resistance from those that once tried to silence. But oral memory has a strength paper does not. Stories carried in voices survive in ways ink cannot. In small gatherings during long evenings when work was done, elders would remind the young that cleverness can outmatch cruelty. They would say, "Never believe you are too small to fight back." They would say the land itself can become your ally if you understand it well enough. Without always knowing it, they were passing down Dorcas's lesson. Her life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. When law protects injustice, morality becomes complicated. When survival is denied, resistance evolves. Dorcas did not seek fame. She did not act to be remembered. She acted because she could not allow Mercy's death to mean nothing. She refused to let 3 miles of distance define the rest of her life. Think about that distance. 3 miles. Close enough to imagine freedom clearly. Far enough to lose everything. That space between hope and heartbreak is where her transformation began. In that narrow stretch of earth, a grieving mother became a strategist. A washerwoman became a force that altered the rhythm of an entire region. We often imagine resistance as loud and dramatic. We picture crowds, speeches, raised fists. But Dorcas teaches us that resistance can also be methodical and quiet. It can be shaped by observation, by memory, by understanding the weaknesses of those who believe themselves strong. She never confronted armed men, face to face. She confronted their certainty. And once certainty cracked, fear did the rest. Today, when we walk through stories of the past, we must ask ourselves what else has been overlooked. How many Dorcas Millers moved through history unseen? How many acts of courage were dismissed because they did not fit the traditional image of heroism? How many systems were shaken by hands that history never bothered to name? This is why we tell these stories here, on Shadows of Black History. Because silence can bury truth. Because textbooks cannot hold every life that mattered. Because sometimes the most powerful chapters are written in whispers rather than proclamations. If you have stayed with this story until now, take a moment and reflect. Imagine the courage it took to walk into dark woods alone night after night. Imagine carrying grief so heavy it could crush you, yet choosing to shape that grief into action. Imagine knowing that one mistake could cost your life, and still moving forward. Dorcas Miller may not stand in statues or fill history books, but her impact lives in the question she leaves behind. What will you do when faced with injustice? Will you wait for someone else to act, or will you study the ground beneath your feet and find your own way to resist? Tell me again where you are watching from. Share your thoughts, your reflections, your questions. And if this journey through hidden resistance has meant something to you, subscribe to Shadows of Black History and like this video. Because as long as we continue to speak these names, the shadows grow lighter, and the quiet courage of the past continues to guide us forward. And even now, as you listen to this story, somewhere in Texas, the wind still moves through pine trees the same way it did in 1859. The ground still holds secrets beneath fallen leaves. The honey locust still grows its long, sharp thorns without apology. Nature has not changed. Only the stories told about it have. Think about how easily Dorcas could have disappeared into silence. She could have carried her grief alone. She could have allowed fear to cage her spirit the way chains once held her body. No one would have blamed her. No one would have expected more from a woman the world refused to see. But she chose differently. She chose to study her enemy. She chose patience over panic. She chose strategy over surrender. And that choice reshaped a region. The slave-catching network near the Mexican border thrived on routine. Riders depended on predictable trails, familiar shortcuts, well-worn bends in the forest. They believed the land belonged to them. Dorcas understood something they did not. The land does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who understands it best. Every tree root, every muddy dip, every narrow crossing became part of her calculation. She did not need guns. She needed knowledge. This is what makes her story so powerful and so unsettling. It challenges the idea that resistance requires wealth or weapons. She had neither. What she possessed was memory, observation, and relentless focus. The same qualities she had been forced to develop just to survive slavery became the very tools that disrupted it. What was meant to keep her small became the source of her strength. Ask yourself something honestly. If those 38 men had not died in what appeared to be accidents, would patrols have weakened? Would more families have reached Mexico safely? Would the slave-catching business in that corner of Texas have slowed the way it did? History may not record the connection clearly, but the timing speaks loudly. 11 nights, 38 deaths, a sudden shift in behavior. Sometimes, patterns tell their own story. And yet, Dorcas never boasted. She never sought credit. That may be the most remarkable part. In a world obsessed with recognition, she remained silent. Not because she lacked pride, but because survival demanded it. Silence protected her. Silence preserved the mystery. Silence allowed the fear to grow larger than any single name. There is also something else we must confront. Her actions were deadly. 38 lives ended in those woods. Even if those men built their wealth on capturing human beings, they were still human. This is where the story becomes complicated. Justice and revenge blur. Grief and strategy intertwine. Dorcas did not stand before a judge. She did not ask permission from any authority. She made a decision in darkness and carried it out with precision. That truth forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. When systems are designed to crush you, what options remain? When the law protects cruelty, where does morality stand? These are not simple questions. They were not simple in 1859, and they are not simple now. Dorcas did not write essays explaining her reasoning. She acted, and history continues to debate silently in her absence. As the decades rolled forward and the memory of slavery began to fade from direct experience into inherited memory, stories like hers became even more important. Not because they glorify violence, but because they reveal complexity. They show that resistance during slavery was not always passive. It was not always limited to escape. It sometimes took forms that made oppressors hesitate, retreat, and reconsider. Imagine being a slave catcher in southeast Texas after those 11 nights. Imagine mounting your horse, adjusting your rifle, and looking down at the ground before every step. Imagine wondering if the soil itself might betray you. That shift in psychology is powerful. Fear, once monopolized by the oppressed, had changed direction. And once fear changes direction, power begins to wobble. Dorcas may never have seen herself as part of a larger movement, yet she was. Across the South, enslaved people resisted in countless ways. Some slowed work, some sabotaged equipment, some learned to read in secret, some fled north or south, some fought openly. Dorcas joined that long tradition of resistance, adding her own method shaped by her environment. Honey locust thorns became her language. The forest became her ally. Now, as we close this chapter of her journey, I want you to hold on to one image. A woman walking alone into the dark woods, carrying a small sack in her hand. No applause. No witnesses. Only the sound of her breath and the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. She kneels, presses a thorn into the earth, and covers it gently. Then she moves to the next spot, and the next. Quiet. Determined. Focused. That is where history shifted. Not in a grand hall, not on a battlefield, but in silence. So, what do we learn from Dorcas Miller? We learn that intelligence can be sharper than steel. We learn that patience can outlast brute force. We learn that even when the world dismisses you, your understanding of it can become your greatest weapon. Tell me, as you reflect on this story, what stands out to you most? Is it her grief, her strategy, the number 38, or the simple image of a thorn in the soil? Share your thoughts below. Let this conversation continue. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Shadows of Black History and like this video. Because every time we speak these hidden histories aloud, we push back against forgetting. And forgetting is the one thing Dorcas Miller refused to allow.